Welcome back to this video lecture series for ethics. You may recall in a previous video when I was outlining some of the major questions that philosophers think about in the realm of ethics, one of the questions I asked you was, would it be possible for someone who is morally corrupt to be happy? Would it be possible for someone who lives their life in the way in which they're lying and cheating and stealing and defrauding others, could that person be living a good, flourishing, and happy human life? This is perhaps one of the most fundamental questions that one can ask about ethics because it really gets to the heart of first, what is human happiness? What does it mean to live a flourishing human life? And also, what is morality? And what role does that play in us living good lives? Because on one way of thinking about morality, it's sort of a set of rules that can seem rather burdensome. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, sure, but that sounds great, but there are certainly been cases in your life where you've thought to yourself, if I could just break one of these moral rules this one time, if I could just lie on during this job interview, maybe it would greatly increase my chances of getting the job. If I could just cheat this one time, it would make my life so much easier. So, of course, we always are confronted with these situations where morality seems like a burden. And so it's really a fundamental question from a philosophical point of view. Does morality, does being a good moral person, make you better off? And that is precisely the question we're going to start looking at in this lesson. And to do so, we're going to look at a selection of a very famous book written by a philosopher named Plato called The Republic. Now, the first thing I'll say about this work is that you'll notice that it's written in a dialogue form. Right, so Plato is the author of The Republic, who was an ancient Greek philosopher. But you'll notice the main character in the dialogue is Socrates, who is also a real person. Although he's a character in this dialogue, he was a real historical philosopher. He, like Plato, was an ancient Greek philosopher, and in fact, Socrates is someone who's seen as Plato's teacher. Plato associated with Socrates, was a close friend of his, and in this dialogue we see Plato using Socrates as sort of a mouthpiece to get his ideas across. Now, this isn't the case of all Plato's dialogues, but it basically is the case in this dialogue. So when I talk about the arguments in the dialogue, I'll be attributing them to Plato and not Socrates. Now, for the majority of this lesson in our examination of the Republic, we're going to be looking at Book 2. But before we get there, I want to make a few preliminary comments, and a lot of those preliminary comments are going to come from some statements made in Book 1. So first, to set the stage, let's talk about a little bit about what is the question that's under consideration. Now, I've already given a preview of this question, and I'm going to call it the prudential value of justice question. What does prudential value mean? It just means, what is the value that this thing has for you? How does something make your life better? How is it good for your self-interest? So you can ask about the prudential value of going to school or entering some relationship or going to work. We're just asking that about justice. So the question is, how does being a good, just person make you better off, increase your well-being? And what's interesting, one of the points that comes up in Book 1 of the Republic, we see Socrates engaging with a specific sort of answer to this question. So one of the people Socrates talks with in Book 1 is Cephalus, who is a very wealthy individual, and Socrates asks him, what's the greatest good you've received from being very wealthy? And Cephalus goes on, he says, when someone has lived a long life and they know that they're near the end of the life, they often become frightened and concerned about many things they hadn't thought of before when they were younger. It's one thing when you're young and your death is far off, but when your death is near, then you really start to think about what your mortality means. And in many ancient Greek religious traditions, and in religious traditions up to this day, there's a story about the afterlife that is connected with how you act in the here and now. Specifically, many religious traditions have this idea that if you act well, then there are rewards and blessings for you in the afterlife. If you act poorly and unjustly, then there's a punishment in the afterlife. And Cephalus seems to believe something like this because he says, if he finds many injustices in his life when he's looking back, he awakes from sleep in terror, as children do, and lives in anticipation of bad things to come. And he later on says that the reason his wealth is so important to him is because it saves him from having to be unjust. If he were poor, if he were impoverished, he might have to lie, cheat, and steal just to survive. He might have to commit injustice in order to get the things he needs. Now, one might debate whether that's really injustice, but just put that aside for the moment. Notice what this says more fundamentally about what the value of justice is. In the view Cephalus is putting forth here, the value of justice is really encapsulated in the fact that it serves your self-interest in a very particular way. Namely, it serves your self-interest in the way that it causes you to avoid punishment. Now, this is certainly a common answer people give to why you should do the right thing, to avoid punishment, whether by the state or whether by God in the afterlife. But we might question whether, if that's really your motivation for being just, are you actually a morally good and just person? Because if the only reason you're doing the right thing, you're being just, is to avoid punishment, then imagine if that punishment wasn't there. Imagine if the state no longer threatened to punish you for stealing. Imagine God no longer threatened to punish you for lying. If that's where your commitment to those things comes from, then are you really an honest person? Are you really a just person? It doesn't seem so, because as soon as those threats are taken away, we would imagine you to be back to lying and cheating and deceiving and stealing. So I think one thing this shows us is that when we're talking about what is the prudential value of justice, Socrates and again really Plato here is not saying that, well, if you're just, you're going to be rewarded with money or rewarded with blessings in the afterlife. He's saying there has to be some other sort of reward. Some sort of reward that involves you being a good morally person and a morally good person and living life as a human being should. That's at least the sort of answer that Plato wants to give, and we're going to, of course, see, in fact, a challenge to that very idea. Okay, so that's one way to answer this prudential value of justice question, just to avoid punishment. And in fact, later in the dialogue in Book 1, Socrates is going back and forth with his interlocutors about what is justice. They're making some fine distinctions and arguments about what justice is. And a pivotal moment occurs when Thrasymachus angrily enters into the discussion. Plato describes it as, he coiled himself up like a beast about to spring, and he hurled himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. Polemarchus and I were frightened and flustered as he roared into our midst. What nonsense have you two been talking, Socrates? Now, why is Thrasymachus so angry? Well, I think he sees the sort of discussion Socrates is having as being very naive. Socrates is having this discussion about justice as a very high value, something very important, but Thrasymachus thinks he's very much naive and wrong about what the nature of justice is. And in fact, Plato uses Thrasymachus in the dialogue at this point to express a view that's known as Immoralism. Okay, so what is Immoralism? It's not the idea that you should do what's morally wrong. It's actually a sort of deeper view even than that. If you're an immoralist, you deny that there is right and wrong in the way we normally think about it. And the way we normally think about right and wrong, we say, well, if it's wrong to steal, then that means it's wrong to do, even if it would, you could gain money from doing it. And there's some higher purpose here, right? Whether it's a purpose of God or whether it's a purpose of fulfilling your nature as a human being, we're saying there's something important about doing that for living a good human life, even if you would benefit materially. But Thrasymachus comes in, he starts to say that you don't understand what really lies behind justice and injustice. In fact, ultimately, it's just power. Thrasymachus tells us, you don't realize that justice is really just the good of another, the advantage of the stronger and the ruler, and harmful to the one who obeys and serves. So, if immoralism says that morality is an illusion, we must wonder, where does this illusion come from? Why do we have these lists of moral rules we're supposed to follow? And Thrasymachus' explanation simply is that it's advantageous to those who are in power that you follow these rules. It's advantageous that you don't lie, cheat, steal, and do any number of other things that can make you more powerful, because they want to hold on to their position. I guess you could say it's a sort of conspiracy theory where morality is propagated from those in power to keep the rest of us servile and subject to their will. And because that's the case, Thrasymachus says, a just man always gets less than an unjust one. This will be a really important theme as we go on, this idea that ultimately justice doesn't pay and injustice does pay. And therefore, he says, I'll repeat what I said before, a person of great power outdoes everyone else. And he says, those who reproach injustice do so because they're afraid not of doing it, but of suffering it. So nothing could be more common than, people in society, your parents, just common cultural messages saying, it's wrong to do injustice. It's wrong to do what's morally wrong. And we say, well, why do people do this? Why do people consistently say you shouldn't lie, cheat, or steal? And Thrasymachus says the reason is because they don't want to suffer those things themselves. Ultimately, it's about those in power holding on to their power. It's about those who have less power making sure they don't want to be harmed. So we're in this situation where all these messages that you should not be unjust. And so Thrasymachus says, for that reason, it in fact is injustice, which is stronger, freer, and more masterly than justice. In Thrasymachus' view, justice is a set of restrictions or restraints on you. It's a set of sort of requirements that don't allow you to flourish and be free. The person who's truly strong, the person who's truly free, doesn't let those requirements hold them down. In fact, as we're going to see, Thrasymachus essentially thinks that it's only because we're too weak to perform injustice that we don't do it. The only reason we follow the rules is because we don't have the power to get around the rules. So what we see Thrasymachus putting forth is a very sort of pessimistic and skeptical view of morality. It's not good for you. It's just propagated by those in power. And it's essentially just a scam. And if you had the power to get around it, you would. Okay. Now, of course, this is not a view that's very popular in moral philosophy, and pretty much every philosopher we're going to examine in this course is going to give you some reason to think that, no, actually, it is good to be moral. It is in your self-interest in a sort of broad sense. And this brings us to Book 2. Now, in Book 2, Socrates is discussing these points with two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus. And these two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're pressing Socrates to give a more convincing case. Well, for what? So, after Thrasymachus makes these claims, Socrates gives some arguments against him, but Glaucon doesn't seem overly convinced, right? He doesn't think Socrates has really proven his case. So he tells Socrates, here's what I want you to do. I want you to persuade us that it's better in every way to be just than unjust. So Glaucon says, I want you to give a stronger argument. He doesn't agree with Thrasymachus, but he says, I want you to give a stronger argument that shows it really is always better to be just than unjust. And we should consider how radical of a claim that is, because Glaucon doesn't want Socrates just to show that it's sometimes better to be just, or that it's most of the time better to be just, but that it's always better to be just. Even if you knew you could get that that job you desire by lying during the interview and get away with it. Even if you knew that, the idea is Glaucon wants Socrates to show that it would still be better for you not to lie, to do the morally right thing. Okay, so this is a rather daunting task given all the ways it seems we can benefit from being immoral. And in order to help Socrates, again, Glaucon says he's going to take Thrasymachus' argument and strengthen it to see if Socrates can respond. And in fact, if you read the rest of the Republic, which we won't do in this course, but if you do, the remainder of the book, the next 8 books, all give a very drawn-out answer to the question why it's better for us to be just. But in any case, how does Glaucon make this argument? Okay, so the first thing Glaucon does is he clarifies what he wants Socrates to show, and he does this by distinguishing between 3 different types of goods, 3 different sort of good things. So he says, some things are good for their own sake. And he gives the following example, something like joy. So think about the joy you get from being with a friend, or just relaxing on a beach, or being at a really fun party, right? when you think about why that party or time at the beach or time with your friend is valuable, usually it's not because you think you're going to get something else out of it. Usually it's because you say, well, I just value that joy, that experience for its own sake. I enjoy that thing in and of itself. Okay, so that's one sort of good. Another sort of good, however, is something that is valued both for its own sake, both in itself, like the joy of meeting with a friend or relaxing on the beach, and for the consequences it brings about. So one example that Glaucon gives of this is knowledge. So you can think about learning new things, thinking from new perspectives. This can be satisfactory in and of itself. It can be an enriching experience to learn things you didn't know before, to gain a deeper understanding of the world. That's inherently valuable, but it's also consequentially valuable. Right, if you gain certain sorts of knowledge, you might be able to learn how to program a computer or fix your car or paint a beautiful painting, any number of things that require specific technical knowledge. So knowledge is good both for itself and for the consequences it brings about. Finally, some things are good merely and solely because of their consequences. And some of the examples that Glaucon gives are things like physical training or medicine. So if you think about exercise, I mean, you might be the sort of person who enjoys exercise, but for many people, exercise is not valuable in and of itself. It's a burden. It's something that you say, well, I'd really rather not do this, but I know I need to be in shape, so I'm going to go ahead and exercise. Or going to the doctor, medicine. I mean, no one really enjoys going to the doctor. No one enjoys going to the waiting room and having to be put on hold while you get there right on time and you wait 10, 15 minutes later. Finally, you get into the doctor's office, you wait some more. Then they give you a regimen of medicine you have to remember to take. It's all very, burdensome and annoying, I suppose. But you undergo and you do that anyway because you know it's going to bring you the benefits of health, even if you don't enjoy doing it. So these are things that are merely valued for the consequences. There are many examples of these sorts of things. Now, the reason Glaucon brings this up is because it brings up the question, if we're saying justice is good, if it has value, specifically it has some value for you, then which of these categories does it fit in? It has to fit in one of them. So, Socrates answers the following. He says, justice is of the second sort of value. It's of the highest value. It's one of the finest goods, he says. It's valued not only for its own sake, but also for its consequences. Justice is inherently valuable and good to yourself for its own sake, and it's also consequentially useful. It has both of these types of value. And for that reason, it's one of the greatest and finest goods. Now, of course, why does Socrates think this? Why does Plato think this? To see that you need to read the rest of the Republic and see the specific answer he gives. But what's more important for our present purpose is what Glaucon says the common answer is. Now again, he doesn't think this answer it's not his view. This is the one actually he wants Socrates to reject. But he says most people think that justice is actually purely valued for its consequences. It's like medicine or exercise. It's something, justice, being kind to people, being considerate, respecting their property rights, not cheating or lying or stealing. These are things that are not necessarily things we want to do. Fundamentally, the common person will say, well, what I would really want to do is be able to cheat and lie and steal and gain money and wealth and power and influence. That's what I really want to do. But the common person says, I recognize I can't do that. Because of, the social censure, the punishment, the retaliation I would experience. And therefore, I do justice specifically for the sake of its consequences. And those consequences are avoiding punishment and also having a good reputation. So, as Glaucon explains, they'd say that justice belongs to the onerous kind. It is to be practiced for the sake of the rewards and popularity that come from a reputation for justice, but is to be avoided because of itself as something burdensome. Okay, now this sets the stage for the dialogue. Because now we have to answer the question, does justice have its own inherent value, as Socrates is suggesting, in which it would always make sense to be just and do the morally right thing? Or is it just something burdensome? Is it like medicine, where you only take it if you need it? You only take it in certain circumstances when you need it for your medicine, when you need it for your health. You only act justly in certain circumstances when you can't get away from it. But it's not really a good thing. Right, so this is going to set the stage for our discussion, and in the videos which follow, we're going to look at how Glaucon makes the case for why justice only has this consequential value, and we'll reflect upon whether that's really the case, and whether there is some sort of higher value to morality and justice. But in any case, I'm going to stop there for the moment. Thank you for watching. I hope this video was useful, and I will see you next time.